Hey guys, welcome back to the Pauper Metagame. Today we're going to be breaking down Burn. I've been a little bit under the weather lately, so if I sound weird, that's what's going on. Don't worry about it. I'm still going to do what we do and keep updating you, deep diving on these Pauper decks. And today we're going to talk about Burn. Burn's actually one of the backbone, most important decks in the format. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably wondering, why in the world would I say that? Because Burn is rarely, if ever, one of the actual top decks in the meta. And that's true. But Burn performs an interesting function because it keeps certain things in check. If Burn can do 20 damage to your face, and you don't have any way with interacting or stopping or racing that, then you've got some real problems. So Burn is an important gatekeeper in the format. Specifically, blue-black tends to have some issues keeping up with Burn, and that's actually not totally irrelevant. If you go check out where the metagame's at right now, blue-black is on the rise. It's got a nice matchup against mono blue and blue-red Delver. Not amazing, but pretty decent. It's also good against a lot of the other aggressive strategies out there. It's pretty decent against elves. A lot of this is also true for mono black, although mono black does have some life gain potential, but it's also a little bit slow with that life gain potential. At any rate, Burn does perform an important function of just sort of keeping things in balance. It does manage to keep a lot of things that have swamps and islands a little bit in check. Although, when I say islands, if you look at something like Mono Blue Delver actually has a reasonably good matchup against Burn because Spellstutter Sprite is so good. And when you look at Burn lists, you've got a lot of 1-drops. So Spellstutter Sprite's going to be quite good. Hydroblast is quite good. So actually, between something like a tempo-based blue deck and a Burn deck, I would rather be sitting on the tempo deck. When I talk about islands, what I really mean and what I really should say is blue-based control strategies. Blue tempo is actually pretty good against Burn. But at any rate, let's move along. So when we get into specifically breaking down Burn, the whole deck really turns on Firebrand Archer and Thermo Alchemist now more than ever. These cards are so important to what this deck is doing, and these cards give the deck some flexibility. Curse of the Pierced Heart in certain matchups will be your most important card. And it's pretty simple. If you're in a matchup where you think the match could go long, say you are up against a control deck, resolving Curse of the Pierced Heart is extremely important. For example, if you're up against a blue-black deck like I was talking about, one of the reasons why Burn can give blue-black fits is because resolving a Curse of the Pierced Heart is very difficult for a blue-black deck to deal with. They don't have enchantment removal. Black doesn't have enchantment removal. Blue doesn't have enchantment removal. Maybe in the sideboard there's some kind of a bounce spell, but that's really about it, and most of the time there's nothing like that available. Hydroblast is the actual best solution for Curse of the Pierced Heart. If you're playing a blue deck and you have to fight back, Hydroblast is an important card. Hydroblast is important in a lot of matchups, and if you're playing against Burn, you might want to try to hold your Hydroblast specifically for Curse of the Pierced Heart, because it's the only card in the deck you probably cannot deal with otherwise. In matchups where, take Stompy. When Mono Red goes up against Stompy, it might not be a terrible idea to even just board Curse of the Pierced Heart out. Now, playing against a deck like Stompy, maybe Mono Red can pivot and try to play more of a control angle, and Curse of the Pierced Heart is okay in that situation. So there's more nuanced thought that has to go into this, more so than just whenever you're up against aggro, always board out your Curse of the Pierced Heart. But if you want to sidestep a lot of nuance and just take a straightforward approach, just remember this rule of thumb if you don't want to get off into the weeds, which is against control and mid-range decks, Curse of the Pierced Heart is really good. Make sure you've got all 4 copies in your deck. I say that because while this list runs 4 copies in the main deck, there are plenty of Burn lists out there that will have 1 or 2 copies in the sideboard. So when you go up against control mid-range, put all 4 copies in the main deck. When you go up against aggro, board all of these out. So what are you boarding in when you go up against aggro? You definitely, and I realize I normally don't skip to the sideboard until I cover the whole deck, but I just want to go ahead and talk about that since I'm already talking about situationally boarding out Curse of the Pierstart. Electrickery and Martyr of Ashes are some cards that are going to be very important against really aggressive decks if you have these in your sideboard. I know not all compositions of Burn have Martyr of Ashes, and some have 4 copies. Personally, I like running 2 copies. I mean, there's nothing wrong with running 1 or 3 or 4, but just personally, for what it's worth, I like 2 copies of Martyr of Ashes in the sideboard. As far as Electrickery, it's really good, and it's tough. I don't want to have 4 copies, and I'm not sure about 2. It's 2 or 3 copies, depending on what I'm doing, where the meta's at, 2 or 3 copies. Pyroblast, I'm actually not really a very big fan of Pyroblast, even though it's really good. The problem with Pyroblast is coming up with a situation where it's just so good that it'll win you the game. Now, it happens, but let's say, let's just talk about baseline what this red deck is doing. Let's go back to that for a minute, and then we'll come back to Pyroblast. So Firebrand Archer and Thermal Alchemist allow each of your burn spells to get an extra point of damage, which is huge. Let's talk about Lightning Bolt, the granddaddy of them all. 3 damage to the face, or you could do 3 damage to a creature. We'll talk about that later. You take your Lightning Bolt and you point it to the dome of your opponent. Bam, 3 damage. If you have a Firebrand Archer out, now we're talking about 4 damage. 4 damage for 1 mana is bonkers. Also, if your opponent has a 1/1 creature in play, you could opt to bolt off their 1/1 creature, do 1 damage to them from the Firebrand Archer trigger, and then attack for 2. So at the end of the turn, you've done the same 3 damage to them that a bolt would normally do, plus you cleared out one of their creatures. And this is one of the powerful aspects that these burn decks take advantage of now. The Thermal Alchemist has, been around for a while, but the addition of Firebrand Archer has allowed for having these extra points of damage to become a little bit more consistent by having a playset of each card. Additionally, Thermal Alchemist can block 2/2 creatures. There are some situations where you can feel reasonably confident that your Alchemist is going to be safe. Most of the time, if you're just racing and you feel like you're winning the race, it's not really worth blocking, because you don't want to have a situation where you're at 20 life, your opponent is at 12 life, and you're blocking their 2/2 creature. Even if you're stopping some damage, unless something really bizarre is going on, you just don't want to risk them using a trick and killing your Thermo Alchemist when you're not in much fear of dying. But if it's getting really close at the end of the game and you just need a few extra blocks, then throwing the Alchemist in the red zone is an option that's available there. The Firebrand Archer can also block, but since it's only got 1 toughness, it's not as good of a blocker as the Thermal Alchemist. Chain Lightning, it's good to remember that your opponent can actually send that back at you, since Chain Lightning has a lot of text that a lot of people don't pay attention to. Of course, the first part is it deals 3 damage to target creature or player, just like Bolt, except Chain Lightning is a sorcery. But it also has this other weird twist that says your opponent can pay 2 red mana, create a copy of Chain Lightning, and then send it back at you. The thing that's really weird, though, is if you have a couple of red mana open after that, you can actually chain the lightning back to your opponent again. So sometimes having your opponent send it back to you isn't so bad as long as you're ready for it and you've kind of thought this all out. But it's something to be mindful of. Lava Spike, 3 damage to the dome. Needle Drop I'll come back to. Shard Volley I'll come back to. Magma Jet I think is an okay one. If it only does 2 damage, but the Scry is nice. The thing about the burn deck is it's got a few slots in here that are sort of flexible. I'll come back to Magma Jet a little bit here in a moment also. Searing Blaze is extremely good. The vast majority of decks out there run creatures. There's just a few obscure niche decks that don't have any creatures. Most of the time, Searing Blaze is a card that's going to do 3 damage to opponent and kill a creature, which helps you with tempo. The other thing about Searing Blaze is you do have to think about, after you've already dropped a few lands, you draw another land, you want to actually hold on to lands in case you draw a Searing Blaze. Typically, once you have your first 2 or 3 lands on board, you're going to want to hold on to a land at all times to make sure you keep the full damage active on Searing Blaze. Rift Bolt, another 3 damage. and Fire Blast. 4 damage to your opponent. You can sacrifice a couple of mountains as an alternative casting cost. So Shard Volley and Magma Jet, and to some extent Needle Drop, these are the cards that are sort of, I would say, the less powerful cards in the deck. In my opinion, if we saw 2 more really good red cards that slotted into the burn deck, the cards that would be most likely to get whittled down, I think you'd see Magma Jet go, you'd see Shard Volley go, you'd probably see a couple of Needle Drops go. I don't think you'd see them all go, and you'd probably see this Curse of the Pierce Heart number go down by 1 or 2 copies. So that's basically the breakdown. Again, Curse of the Pierce Heart in certain matchups is your best card, but against certain aggressive decks, if the game's only going to go 4 turns and you're dropping Curse of the Pierce Heart on turn 2, you know, it's just kind of questionable. Like, maybe you get in a couple 2 or 3 damage, but it's just not amazing. Magma Jet, it's okay given the available card pool. I do like having 1 copy of Magma Jet, but it is underwhelming. If we got another Lava Spike or Chain Lightning or Lightning Bolt type card, Magma Jet would be one of the cards that I would drop. Same goes for Shard Volley. Now, the thing about Shard Volley that makes it especially questionable is the sacrificing of a land, which doesn't seem like a big deal until you realize most burn lists also run 4 Fire Blasts. So it's not like you can't run a Shard Volley, but what could happen very reasonably in a match is you draw 2 copies of Fire Blast. So you actually need to sack 4 mountains. And a lot of matches with burn, if things are going well, you're not going to get to 5 drops or 5 land drops. You're just going to have 4 mountains, maybe only 3. If you only have 3, then that's fine. Shard Volley and a Fire Blast works out just fine. And I'm not saying Shard Volley is terrible here, but it's also just one of these things where if there's a card missing from this list that you want to slot in and try out, dropping either Magma Jet or Shard Volley is probably the way to go. For a long time, Needle Drop was one of the more 50-50 kind of cards in the deck. Doing 1 damage for 1 mana is really not amazing. It does cantrip, but what happens when you do a damage to your opponent? You draw a card and it's a land. I mean, you have to realize that when you're running 18 lands, nearly a third of your deck is land. So cards that cantrip, they're really only giving you 2/3 of a card. I know that's a convoluted way of looking at it, but Needle Drop's real text is do 1 damage to your opponent, and you've got a 2/3 chance of drawing something relevant after that. Having said that, when you're running Thermo Alchemist and Firebrand Archer, Needle Dropping someone, doing 2 damage for 1 mana, and having a reasonable chance at drawing some more action is really good. And that's why I think at this point running 4 copies of Needle Drop is really not that bad. Also, Curse of the Pierced Heart, if you get one of those online, you also have extra insurance that you're never going to draw into a Needle Drop and have it be a dead card. Now, the other thing that I have to mention about Needle Drop is you can actually only cast it when you've already dealt damage. So let's say you don't hit any Curse of the Pierced Heart copies in your deck, and let's say your opponent blows up your Firebrand Archers and your Thermal Alchemists every time you cast them. Let's say you're going up against a mono black deck and they just have so much removal it's very easy for them to kill your only 8 creatures in your deck. And you just don't hit any Curse of the Pierced Heart, and you run out of cards and you top deck into a Needle Drop. And you can't cast it, and then they hit you with discard. That's a bad feeling. That's the drawback to Needle Drop. Unlike consistent, reliable burn cards like Chain Lightning, Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt, Rift Bolt, Fire Blast, some of these cards have their drawbacks. Like Searing Blaze, you can really only cast it if there's a creature in play to target, and Needle Drop can also run into problems when you don't have any other sources of damage that you can deal. Now, those are kind of corner cases. Most of the time, Searing Blaze and Needle Drop will be live, and given the composition of this deck, they're both quite good cards most of the time. Having a few copies of Forgotten Cave is handy because flooding out is another way that the burn deck is going to lose, and usually burn can shell out most of its cards reasonably quickly. So it's not necessarily a problem if your opening turn you don't have any action because your first land comes down tapped. You can definitely catch up when you have a lot of 1-drops in your deck. On the other hand, if burn draws, I don't know, a really bad situation occurs where you have 7 cards in your opening hand, you draw another 8 cards, so we're talking about 15 cards, and let's say 9 of those cards are lands, you're not going to get there. You're losing that match most likely. So flooding out can be a real problem for burn. Having some Forgotten Caves in there can smooth things out. So basically most of the time what you're trying to do is you're trying to just go to the dome, deal damage to your opponent's face. The inclusion of things like Curse of the Pierce Heart, Firebrand Archer, and Thermo Alchemist do allow you to play a control game. When you go up against certain aggressive decks, you do have the option to turn the corner and play the role of control. And the way this works is you use your removal cards to kill your opponent's creatures. And if you have, say you've got a Thermo Alchemist and a Firebrand Archer out there, or let's just say you just have 2 Thermo Alchemists, you don't even have the ability to attack. You keep killing your opponent's creatures, and every time you kill your opponent's creatures, you get extra activations on your Thermo Alchemist. So by having 2 copies of Thermo Alchemist in play, every turn they play a creature, every turn you kill it, you get the regular activation out of your Thermo Alchemist, and then you get an extra activation whenever you play a spell. And if you have 2 Thermo Alchemists out, this means just by using one of your burn spells to kill your opponent's creature every turn, you could be doing 4 points of damage. It doesn't take long for that to close out the game, or to get you close enough where you can actually use a couple of your burn spells to finish your opponent off. This is an important angle of play for an advanced burn player to understand. It's very easy to just get in the autopilot, I'm going to point all my burn at my opponent's face and win games that way. And a lot of the time, that's the correct way to do it. But you just need to be mindful that in certain particular matchups, and even if not for the whole matchup, if you get behind, if you have to, there's a chance you can play a little more controlling and come back. In some situations, it's really not ideal, but it's something you have to be aware of. Also, when you go up against blue-red and mono-blue Delver decks, you definitely want to be mindful of the Spell Stutter Sprite coming down and blowing up some of your removal. So in those kinds of situations, you just want to be careful and have extra removal in hand. So, for example, Lightning Bolt, because it's an instant and can kill a creature, becomes especially valuable. Because if you're trying to lead with a Lava Spike and they play a Spell Stutter Sprite, and then you cast Lightning Bolt, that can help clean the situation up. And, again, you can't respond with a Needle Drop to kill a Spell Stutter Sprite. Shard Volley is an option, but you may not want to sack mountains too early. Magma Jet is also good, another reason why it's worth including. Searing Blaze is fine, but you do want to make sure you think out your plays and how these things could go by having a land in play. This is kind of tricky because if you're afraid they might Spell Stutter Sprite, so you play an extra land instead of holding it for later, and then they don't respond with Spell Stutter Sprite, and you don't have another land, well, now your Searing Blaze may go semi-inactive. But the other thing is, if you're up against Spell Stutter Sprites, don't be afraid to just Searing Blaze for 1 damage if you need to. It's better to do that and perhaps jam another burn spell through than to wait, because a 1 damage Searing Blaze plus a Lightning Bolt is 4 damage, whereas a full power Searing Blaze is 3 damage, and 4 damage is more than 3 damage. So, when you're dealing with Spell Stutter Sprites, don't be afraid to go with Searing Blaze. One of the, just going back to the sideboard here for a second, one of the reasons why I tend to lean a little bit towards wanting to have 3 copies of Electrickery in my sideboard on the burn list is because I feel like you really have to pay respect to decks like Boggles. Even though Boggles isn't huge in the metagame right now, Burn just cannot deal with Boggles. They usually have some extra life gain enchantments to bring in, and being able to wipe out Boggles is really important. Martyr of Ashes, though, I mean, if you can make up for having less Electrickeries by having more Martyr of Ashes, but Electrickery is also really good. It kills Delvers, it kills Fairies. It just does a lot of work. It's great versus Elves. So, I don't know. Electrickery just seems really good in this meta, and I'd probably like to have 3 copies of that. I would probably run like 3 copies of Electrickery and 2 copies of Martyr of Ash, but whatever. Pyroblast I'm just not a fan of. The reason I'm not a fan is because if you use Pyroblast to force another burn spell through, it's pretty pointless. So, for example, you go Lightning Bolt on your opponent, and they play Counterspell, and you play Pyroblast. So you force through 3 damage. You had to use 2 cards to do it. In another scenario, you play Lightning Bolt, they counterspell it, and then you play Lava Spike. Well, it's the exact same outcome. So let's say they play a Mole Drifter and you Pyroblast it. Well, you're not trying to play a card advantage or tempo game. I mean, yeah, maybe somehow there's some corner cases where that helps you win, but I mean, really, maybe your opponent's glad that that was a counterspell on their Mole Drifter instead of you actually jamming more damage through on your opponent. Because from their standpoint, they played a card that said, counter target opponent's burn spell because you played a Pyroblast instead of burning your opponent. The only way that Pyroblast is really good, in my opinion, is if it's really a pivotal situation that's jamming through a lot of extra damage that couldn't otherwise be done. I mean, maybe protecting your Curse of the Pierced Heart against Hydroblast. I don't know. I'm just not a big fan of Pyroblast. I think Pyroblast is an amazing card in most lists. For example, I think Pyroblast is reasonably good to really amazingly good in Is It Delver. I think it's great in most of the sideboards it's in. I'm not as big of a fan in Burn because if you board it in, you're probably pulling out some Burn, and in most of the matchups, that's not what you want to be doing. The other thing I would point out is I know somebody out there is probably thinking, well, 2 Lava Spikes and they have a counterspell means you're getting 3 damage through, but if it's a situation where you play a Fire Blast and they go to counterspell it and you Pyroblast, well, now you were able to give 4 damage through. So there are situations where Pyroblast can be better than just having another Bolt or Lava Spike. And while that's true, there's also situations where both of your Pyroblasts end up sitting in your hand and your opponent's at 3 life and you're just sitting there pulling your hair out thinking, if I just had another actual burn spell instead of Pyroblast, maybe I actually could have won this match. So you lose consistency in what you're trying to do. And I just think the corner cases where Pyroblast is going to give you more value than one of your burn spells is low enough that I don't think it's worth its slot space in the sideboard. Personal rant, I'm not saying you're crazy if you have Pyroblast in your sideboard. Most people do, I get it. Flaring Pain is just there in case your opponent has some methodologies, Prismatic Strand, Circle Protection Red, to stop you from being able to deal your damage. So Flaring Pain just helps you jam everything through. Smash Smithereens is good against whatever artifacts happen to be plaguing you, and yes, it's an auto bring in against Affinity every time to help you win that tempo race. Molten Rain is here. It's not a card that I disagree with, but you really have to think about what matchups. I mean, obviously Tron is not a bad place to bring this in, but Tron's pretty dirtily also, and Pulse of Murasa is one way that they can blow you out. I mean, if they Pulse of Murasa, gain 6 life, and they Mnemonic Wall to get their Pulse of Murasa back, cast it again, now they've gained 12 life. Doing shenanigans like that is a way for them to blow you out. But to keep doing those shenanigans, they do need a lot of mana, so being able to Molten Rain off some land is important. The problem is you're only running 2 copies of Molten Rain, and making them stumble a little bit may or may not be enough. Also, because Burn only runs 18 lands, you could also be in a situation where you only draw 2 lands over the course of 5 turns, and if you had another Burn spell, you could win the game, but you're sitting on a Molten Rain you can't even cast. So it does get back to the consistency issues. There's plenty of decks out there that also run bounce lands, so you could get some value out of blowing up a bounce land, getting some nice tempo, which is not irrelevant, and doing a couple points of damage. Lastly, I'm not saying you should do this, but you can at least think about, against Affinity, if you think there's a reasonable chance you're going to be using your Smash to Smithereens on your opponent's lands, you can get a little more extra consistency on hosing your opponent's lands with Molten Rain. The problem with this is Affinity is usually pretty fast, and a lot of the times they're going to be able to already have a lot of creatures out by the time you could actually cast Molten Rain. So I don't love that strategy, but it's something you can think about if you think you're going to go that way. Not necessarily personally what I would do, but hey, it's good to consider all your options. The last thing I want to do is I just want to pull up a few other burn lists just so you can survey a few other styles and approaches to the deck. So here we see this is pretty close to the same thing. So this deck actually goes with the full 20 lands, and it opted to drop Shard Volley and Magma Jet. So that's another option you can go with. I don't know if I really love it. 20 lands, again, one of the ways that Burn can definitely lose is by flooding out. If you hit 1 to 2 lands, you're in reasonable shape. 3 is probably ideal. 5 or 6 is real bad. So I don't know. I don't really love running 20 land. Blazing Volley, it's okay. They're going really heavy on having Electrickery style options, and they're not bothering with Martyr of Ashes. Maybe that was an intentional choice. Maybe they just don't know the card exists. Stagger Shock's kind of interesting here. I don't really love it because even though it's getting you 4 damage for 1 card, it costs 3 mana. So just not a huge fan of that. Alright, next up, here we are, back to 18 lands, 1 Shard Volley, 1 Magma Jet, and yeah, 3 Electrickeries, 1 Martyr of Ash. They go to full 4 Pyroblast. I already told you how I feel about that. And they up to 3 Molten Rain, which is interesting, not necessarily terrible. And then here we see a list that's, let's see here, looks like, okay, so here, okay, I like this. We got Flame Rift in the mix here. So Flame Rift is a red and a colorless 4 damage to each player. So I mean, you're really going all in when you adopt this kind of a strategy. Now they're also running 2 Magma Jet. This is one of those lists that has opted to drop 2 Curse of the Pierce Heart. So that's kind of where we're seeing some of the change up here. Most of everything else is the same. I do think Flame Rift is interesting. I'm not someone who pilots Burn all the time. I've played it here and there. As aggressive as the meta is right now, I don't really like Flame Rift. This is not the direction that I would want to go. But it's an option. There's also another card you can run. It's a 3/3 creature. It's a red and a colorless, so it costs 2 mana. It's got oh, I forget. It's like fading or something like that, vanishing, something like that, where it's only going to be. It only lives long enough to attack 1 time, and you could, although it lives long enough, you can block with it after you pass the turn you've cast it, and then it still lives long enough, I think, to. Let's see, maybe, no, I guess that's about it. But anyway, if you actually get in with the attack, it does 3 damage. It also does a damage when it comes into play, and it does a damage when it leaves play. So it's going to do 2 damage. That used to be a creature card that was auto included in burn lists, but these days you don't see it as often. I can't remember the name of the card. Sorry about that. But anyway, it's just something if you really get to digging around on Magic Online. Just go into the cards and search for red creatures that cost exactly 2 mana and that are legal in Pauper, and you'll find it. I'm not saying you should play it because, frankly, the meta. I trust the way the meta evolves. I tend to trust the lists that are out there that are actually doing well as being legitimate evolutions on these deck lists, yeah, I mean, we don't see that being played in any of these lists, so I think that's just a little bit of history at this point, and worth mentioning because who knows, maybe at some point having more than just 8 creatures in the deck is something to consider. The only other thing I'll say is about all of these lists is I don't think it would be a terrible thing if there was another creature in the lists, because when you only have these 8 really good creatures, if you don't have a lot of other creatures, it makes it fairly easy for your opponent to remove these really good creatures and to not really get the value out of them that you'd like to get. Having said that, you don't want to get too creature heavy with these lists because your Thermo Alchemist and your Firebrand Archer benefit off of you playing instants and sorceries. The Firebrand Archer could also profit off of you playing an enchantment or an artifact. It's worth mentioning that when you have a Firebrand Archer out and you play Curse of the Pierce Heart, you will get the Firebrand Archer trigger. But having some other creatures in the mix would be handy. Maybe just another playset of something just to also draw out some removal. Another thing that's interesting and worth pointing out is if you happen to be playing in a matchup where your opponent has a lot of removal, I think one of the reasons why you will see people rocking the Pyroblast strategy is because you could actually board out some of your Thermo Alchemists and Firebrand Archers against a really removal heavy deck, which I know sounds crazy, but if they're just dying, if your Firebrand Archer and your Thermo Alchemist are just dying to removal as soon as they hit the board, they're really not doing a whole lot for you. So boarding some number of copies out is actually not a terrible strategy, again, even though it is really your best card in most matchups. But that's only valid if you have cards you can board in that are going to perform well in the match. Again, I like to run 2 Curse of the Pierce Heart in the main with 2 in the side. The reason for that is because Curse of the Pierce Heart, in my opinion, again, is only really good against mid-range and control decks, so there's a lot of aggressive decks out there. And this leaves me in a position when I go into sideboarding to either board out my remaining 2 copies or board in 2 copies. I like to have 2 copies of Curse of the Pierceheart in the sideboard because frankly I would rather be boarding in 2 copies of Curse of the Pierceheart against the blue-black deck than boarding in a couple of Pyroblasts. Or if I'm up against a mono-black deck, Pyroblast isn't really an option anyway. Also, you'll notice that another reason to have something like Molten Rain is it's another good option to boarding it in against something like blue-black control, because if you really think about it, out of these options, you don't have a ton of stuff you can really board in against blue-black control. You don't want to board in Electrickery, you don't want to board in Martyr of Ashes, Pyroblast, that's fine. Flaring Pain's probably unnecessary. Smash to Smithereens, they may not even have any artifacts, so you may only have the Molten Rains and the Pyroblast, which is fine because maybe you board out your Thermo Alchemists or 2 Firebrand Archers and 2 Thermo Alchemists or whatever you come up with. Personally, I'd probably just, I don't know. The reason there's pluses and minuses here is because Firebrand Archer dies to pretty much any removal. If they have something like a Disfigure, a Thermo Alchemist could live through that. On the other hand, if you actually are going to have one of these creatures resolve, most of the time if they have a removal card, either of them would die. And if the Firebrand Archer is going to live, it's a little bit better because in addition to the triggers, it can also attack for 2. So, you know, those are the trade-offs. If you know your opponent has a lot of things that do -1/-1 and -2/-2, or deal 1 or 2 damage, then the Thermo Alchemist is better. If they just have generic removal, then the Firebrand Archer is better because if it actually resolves and lives, it's going to do more damage. So, yeah, those are basically the things to think about when you're playing your burn deck. Overall, I think burn is in a really bad place in the meta. I would not play burn right now. If you're playing burn, frankly, I think you're a very brave person, and I wouldn't do it. The reason is because Izzet Delver has got a nice matchup against burn. They're able to get in there, get aggressive, and do damage to you, and in order to win the race, they only have to be able to counterspell a few of your burn spells, while also blowing off and removing some of your few creatures that you have, and they're able to do all of that very easily and efficiently. I would not want to run up against Izzet Delver playing burn because Izzet Delver most of the time is going to win. Also, they usually have some Hydroblasts in the sideboard, and their Hydroblasts are much more effective against you than your Pyroblasts are going to be against them. Kuldotha Boros has enough rando life gain options built into the deck that it's also kind of a beating, and they have enough aggressive things that they can combine their aggression with their life gain usually to blow you out. Against something like Tron, if everything comes together right, you hit maybe your land destruction off your sideboard, you can do it. Also, if you get lucky and they just don't draw the right things. But the problem is, if they are able to cycle a Pulse of Murasa, get ready for a miserable time, because Tron actually can gain a reasonable amount of life, and usually they have a few counter spells, and it's not crazy for them to be able to cobble enough things together to be able to beat a burn deck. Now, blue-black control has been rising up in the metagame because it's reasonably positioned, and you can just parasitically feed on blue-black control. If they have a lot of counter spells in the main, and they've got the Hydroblast in the sideboard, and they've got some aggression, it's not like this is a complete free win, but you're usually pretty well favored, which is one reason why you don't necessarily need to worry about your sideboard options specifically against blue-black control. But nonetheless, it's a reasonably okay matchup. Elves, you actually have a reasonable game against elves just because you can control and kill the really dangerous elves and incrementally win the game. This is definitely one of those matchups where you want to consider playing more of a control style against the opponent, and definitely be ready to immediately kill their well-wishers. Mono Blue Delver, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a matchup that I like as a burn player. Stompy is tricky. I think burn actually has a pretty good matchup against Stompy, but you really got to be super careful against Stompy because they have Vault Scourge. So let me just give you a little scenario. Let's say your opponent manages to get a Vault Scourge on the board with a mana open, like they play Vault Scourge on turn 2, and you drop some kind of a burn spell that can target a creature, and in response they Vines of Vastwood. And then the next turn they've got 3 mana, they play a Dust Invader, they sack the little derpy creature that adds a colorless, and then they drop a Hunger of the Howlpack on their Vault Scourge, and they dome you for 4 and gain 4 life. And then they put a Rancor on it to boot or something. I don't know. I guess there may not actually be enough mana for him to do all those things that turn. But if they're able to actually start making this Vault Scourge get big, you are going to lose. Also, just because of the nature of Hunger of the Howlpack and Elephant Guide, they're going to be able to grow creatures to a size where you're going to have to spend multiple burn spells to deal with them, which is really not great. Having said that, if you can play the game such that you can keep them off of Hunger of the Howlpack and Elephant Guides and Rancors, which is sort of possible. Again, if they have a Vines of Vastwood, it means you're actually going to need multiple removal spells in some situations. But if you can keep them from powering up their creatures and again play something of a controlling role in the game, you do have a reasonable chance to actually just straight up win. Also, the nice thing about the Vault Scourge is, from your standpoint, while it does have lifelink, they have to pay 2 life to put it into play, which certainly plays into your whole approach to the game. You just have to be very, very sure that you're going to kill the Vault Scourge and that they're not going to be able to power it up, because that's a disaster. So it's weird. Also, Stompy is very aggressive. And yeah, I don't know, it's just kind of one of those things where it's not like your best matchup, but it's really not your worst either. Boggles is kind of scary because, like I was alluding to earlier, they usually have the playset of Armadillo Cloaks in the main, which is quite bad. But they usually have one, if not more, copies of Lifelink also in the sideboard, and some lists will even have an extra Lifelink in the main deck. Combine that with the fact that their creatures are all hexproof, and yeah, it could be pretty bad. Like if they go turn 1 Glade Cover Scout or turn 1 Slippery Bogle, and then they roll that into a turn 2 Utopia Sprawl on a forest, and then drop an Ethereal Armor on their creature, and then turn 3 they go Armadillo Cloak. Yeah, good game. That's it. You're going to lose. So that's why having some options in your sideboard to fight back is important, because the Boggles matchup could be a real nightmare for Burn. Inside Out combo actually is not great, because they can use their counter spells to live just long enough to Alpha Strike you. It's rough. They've got things like Dispel in the main board. That is brutal as a Burn deck. Like going up against a deck that actually has Dispel, not in the sideboard, in the main board. They also have 4 copies of Circular Logic as well. And the rough thing is, if you try to just figure, well, I'll hold up extra, mana always, so that if they try to power up a Tireless Tribe, I can throw multiple burn spells through the counter spells and win the game that way once they try to combo out. Well, the problem is you don't have that many lands in your burn deck, so if they see that you're kind of slow playing with your burn, then all they have to do is get Giga Drouse, tap you out, and then they're guaranteed to be able to win. And oh, by the way, they also have Dizzy Spell, which they can use to transmute to go get a Giga Drouse. So, and they have 4 copies of Hydroblast and another Dispel in the sideboard. So this is just gross. Not to mention they have Standard Bearer, which is kind of annoying, because it means that Standard Bearer not only protects their Tireless Tribe, but it also forces you to point Burn at the Standard Bearer. So if it's a situation where you've got a Lightning Bolt and your Inside Out combo players at 3 life, and you are so excited because you're about to burn them out, oh wait, if there's a Standard Bearer on board, you can't, because you have to target the Standard Bearer. So that can be kind of annoying. Also, it's not unusual to see 1 or multiple copies of Daze in this deck, and again, the Burn deck usually doesn't have a lot of land, and if you do have a lot of land, well, you're probably losing anyway, because flooding out again is a real problem. So yeah, this matchup, it's just not great for Burn. Same thing with Izzet Blitz. I mean, there's just a lot of matches. Affinity, once you sideboard, being able to actually bring in stuff to kill artifacts and do damage is really good, but Mono White Heroic has a lot of ways to protect its creatures from Burn, and it also usually has Seekers of the Way and Sacred Cats either in the main or the sideboard. So, not to mention occasionally also lifelink options. So, I mean, there's just basically, it's not a good time to be playing Burn. I think the reason why Burn is where it's at in the meta right now is not because Burn is good. It's because a lot of people who aren't familiar with the Pauper metagame think, oh yeah, I'll just play burn. It's a fine deck. No, it's terrible right now. It's absolutely horrible. I mean, it's good that some people play it because it does keep everything in balance, but you're just a glutton for punishment if you're running burn right now. If you're brand new to the format, I would say just play Mono Blue Delver. You may not be playing it completely optimally, but you're gonna play it reasonably well. It's really not that complicated to execute the baseline strategy of get creatures out and then try to attack and kill your opponent and use counter spells to disrupt their plan and bounce spells to disrupt their plan and kill your opponent before they kill you. I mean, I'm not saying it's like a baseline rookie level deck, but it's good. It's a good, effective strategy, and I think even if you're playing it suboptimally, it's still going to be better than burn. And while burn might even maybe has a better matchup against Stompy than Stompy has against burn, I would rather play Stompy. Also, is a very fine option. Elves is a fine option for a new player. I don't think I would recommend Tron to a brand new Pauper player. But yeah, basically I would recommend almost anything but Tron over burn right now. Blue-black control, I mean, it's not. I mean, it's really not. Even though we might think of control as being more advanced than aggro, it's not that complicated. Anyway, yeah. So that's burn, folks. Glad people play it, but I strongly recommend against it right now. And yeah, if you whatever you play, whether you play burn or play something else, good luck out there and stay safe.